The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into my wrists as Sheriff Sheila Dawson smirked down at me. I knelt in the dirt of my own land, land that had been in my family for generations, while my teenage daughter screamed from our porch. The deputies held her back as tears streamed down her face. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Sheila's voice, cool and professional for the body camera she wore. Obstruction of justice, trespassing on a closed roadway, threatening an officer. None of it was true. I had simply tried to access my own farm using the same road my family had used for 60 years. But there I was, face pressed against my own fence post, watching as Sheila picked up something from the patrol car and walked toward me with deliberate slowness. She knelt beside me, her voice dropping to a whisper that only I could hear. "I told you to sell that corner parcel. Now look what happened." And that was when I realized this was never about road safety or county regulations. Sheriff Sheila Dawson had been systematically forcing rural landowners to bend to her will, but she had no idea who she had just pushed too far. Hash. The McCormick farm has been standing longer than most buildings in Hawkins County. My great-grandfather cleared this land with horses and hand tools in 1927. My grandfather expanded it during the boom years after the war. My father modernized it when I was just a boy. And when cancer took him 3 years ago, I inherited every acre, every fence post, and every responsibility that came with it. I am not a complicated man. I wake before dawn, tend to my livestock, maintain my equipment, and work my fields until the light fades. The farm produces corn, soybeans, and enough hay to support my small herd of cattle. It is not a glamorous life, but it is an honest one. The calluses on my hands tell the story of each season, each harvest, each repair job completed by moonlight when the day's work was not enough. The gravel road that connects my property to County Highway 16 has been there almost as long as the farm itself. It is a simple thing, crushed limestone atop packed earth, maintained at my own expense, though it serves as access for the Miller property beyond mine as well. In spring, I fill the potholes. In winter, I clear the snow. I have never asked the county for help with it. That road is the lifeline of my operation, the only way to move equipment, receive deliveries, and transport my harvest to market. That Tuesday morning in April began like any other. I had arranged for a delivery of new fencing materials. The southeast pasture needed repair after a particularly brutal winter had taken down several sections. The delivery was scheduled for 9, which gave me time to finish the morning feeding and prepare the old tractor with the front loader to move the heavy posts. I remember the golden light of that morning, the dew still clinging to the pasture grass, the familiar rumble of my truck as I turned onto the gravel road, heading out to meet the delivery at the highway junction. I was already planning the day's work in my head, calculating how many posts I could set before sundown when I saw them. Bright orange traffic cones stretched in a line across the entrance to my access road. A county sheriff's cruiser sat idling beside them, its lights off but its presence unmistakable. I slowed to a stop, dust from my truck settling around me in the morning light. For a moment, I thought there must have been an accident, perhaps a tree down across the road, or a washout from the heavy rains the week before. I stepped out of my truck and approached the cruiser. The window rolled down to reveal a young deputy I did not recognize, Johnson, according to his nameplate. His face showed neither hostility nor welcome, just the blank professionalism of a man following orders. "Morning," I said, removing my cap. "There a problem with the road?" "Temporary access restriction," he replied, not quite meeting my eyes. I waited for more explanation. None came. The silence stretched between us until I had to break it myself. "This is my road," I said. I have a delivery coming, farm supplies. The deputy shifted in his seat. Orders are no vehicle access until further notice. Public safety concern. What safety concern? I asked, feeling the first flicker of irritation. I maintained this road myself last week. There are no safety issues. He handed me a printed notice with the county sheriff's letterhead. You will need to contact the department for details. I am just here to enforce the restriction. I read the paper, but it contained nothing beyond what the deputy had already told me. A temporary road closure due to unspecified safety concerns. No timeline for reopening. No alternate access suggestions. Just a bureaucratic wall between me and my own property. I need to call my delivery, I said finally. Tell them to delay. Do you know how long this will be in effect? The deputy shrugged. Cannot say. You will need to speak with the sheriff's office. I returned to my truck and sat with the engine off, staring at the cones that now controlled my livelihood. I called the fencing supplier and explained the situation, rescheduling for the following week at the cost of a restocking fee. As I ended the call, I watched the deputy adjust his rearview mirror to keep an eye on me. That was the first move in what I would later understand was a carefully orchestrated game. But at that moment, I was simply a farmer with a blocked road, a delayed delivery, and a growing sense that something was not right in Hawkins County. I did not yet know her name. I did not yet understand her purpose. But looking back, that line of orange cones was the first battle line in a war I never asked to fight. Hash. The Hawkins County Sheriff's Department occupied a squat brick building across from the courthouse. It had been renovated recently. Gleaming new windows and a freshly paved parking lot stood in stark contrast to the aging structures around it. I parked my truck in a visitor space and took a moment to collect myself. I had changed out of my work clothes, putting on a clean button-down shirt and my least worn pair of jeans. This was not a social call, but I wanted to be taken seriously. The front desk was staffed by a civilian administrator whose nameplate read Margaret. She looked up from her computer with the practiced neutral expression of someone who dealt with complaints all day. I need to speak with someone about a road closure on my property, I said, placing the notice on the counter between us. Margaret glanced at the paper, then at me. Do you have an appointment? No, but this is urgent. I have a farm to run, and my access has been completely cut off without explanation. She typed something into her computer. Sheriff Dawson is very busy today. You could speak with one of the deputies, or I can schedule you for next week. I would prefer to speak with whoever made this decision, I replied, keeping my voice even. My livelihood depends on that road. Margaret's phone rang, and she answered it with a practiced smile. After a brief conversation, she looked up at me with mild surprise. Sheriff Dawson can give you 5 minutes. Down the hall, last door on the right. I thanked her and walked through the security door she buzzed open. The hallway was lined with official photographs, county commissioners, past sheriffs, and ceremonial gatherings. At the end of the hall, a door stood open, revealing a spacious office with windows overlooking the courthouse square. Sheriff Sheila Dawson sat behind a large desk, reviewing a document. She did not look up immediately when I entered. She was in her mid-40s, with short brown hair streaked with premature gray and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Her uniform was impeccable, her badge polished to a mirror shine. When she finally acknowledged my presence, her eyes were sharp and evaluating. "You must be McCormick," she said, removing her glasses. "Margaret says you have concerns about road access." "Yes, Sheriff. My farm access road has been blocked without explanation or prior notice. I have deliveries scheduled, equipment to move, and a business to run." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. I remained standing. The notice cites safety concerns, I continued, but I maintain that road myself. There are no safety issues. Sheriff Dawson shuffled some papers on her desk, pulling out a thin file. We have received reports about commercial traffic on an unregulated access point. County Ordinance 47B gives us authority to restrict traffic pending investigation. Commercial traffic. It is a farm road. Farm vehicles use it. That is hardly commercial traffic. Your recent delivery schedules suggest otherwise, she replied, glancing at the file. Multiple heavy vehicles per week is beyond normal agricultural use. I felt my patience thinning. I am replacing fencing damaged in the winter storms. That requires materials. How else am I supposed to maintain my property? Through properly permitted and inspected access points, she replied coolly. The investigation will determine if your road meets county standards. Until then, the restriction stands. How long will this investigation take? I asked. However long is necessary to ensure public safety. Her tone made it clear the discussion was ending. You can file an expedited review request with the clerk if you wish, but the process takes time. Sheriff, this seems excessive for a private farm road that has existed for decades. She closed the file with a deliberate motion. Mr. McCormick, I understand your frustration, but my department has procedures to follow. The road is closed until our investigation is complete. That will be all. I recognized dismissal when I heard it. I had received no real answers, no timeline, and no recourse. As I turned to leave, she spoke once more. I would advise against attempting to circumvent the roadblock. My deputies are instructed to enforce it fully. The implied threat hung in the air as I walked out. The entire meeting had lasted less than 4 minutes. In town later that day, I stopped at Grayson's Feed and supplied to order some mineral blocks for my cattle. While waiting for Jim Grayson to process my order, I overheard 2 contractors talking in low voices by the fence posts. Another stop work order from the sheriff's department, one said. Third one this month. No explanation, just a citation and a fine if we continue. Classic Sheila, the other replied. Remember what happened to old man Wilson when he tried fighting her on that easement dispute. They noticed me listening and fell silent. Jim returned with my receipt, and after the other customers left, I asked him about what I had overheard. Jim, what was that about Sheriff Dawson and stop work orders? He glanced toward the door before answering. Sheila has been running this county her way since she took office 3 years ago, especially out in the rural areas where there is less oversight. What happened with Wilson? I asked. Henry Wilson had a nice 40 acres out by the lake, wanted to build a workshop, but it would have been visible from Sheila's sister's lake house. Suddenly he had permit problems, access issues, environmental reviews. After 6 months of fighting, he sold the property and moved to Tennessee. As I drove home, taking the long detour around my blocked road, I pieced together what various townspeople told me. Sheriff Sheila Dawson had a pattern. She used her authority, particularly traffic control and access restrictions, to pressure people into compliance with her unstated wishes. Sometimes it was personal, sometimes it was on behalf of connected people in the county. But the pattern was clear. Cross Sheila Dawson, and suddenly the full bureaucratic weight of Hawkins County would make your life difficult. I did not yet know what she wanted from me, but as I parked in the field and walked the half-mile to my house, because my own driveway was now off-limits, I knew one thing for certain. Sheriff Sheila Dawson had picked the wrong farmer to intimidate. Hash. The temporary roadblock became permanent 3 days later. I discovered this when I hiked out to the highway before dawn, planning to meet the rescheduled fencing delivery and direct them to an old tractor path that cut through the north pasture. It would damage my fields, but at least I could get the materials delivered. What I found stopped me cold. The orange cones had been replaced by metal barricades, the kind used at accident scenes, and a chain-link gate had been installed across the entrance. A large printed sign was zip-tied to the center, "Road closed by order of HAWKINS County Sheriff. Unauthorized access prohibited. VIOLATORS subject to arrest." Beside the new gate, a deputy sat in his cruiser, thermos in hand. It was Deputy Johnson again, looking uncomfortable as I approached on foot. "This is not temporary anymore," I said, gesturing to the gate. "No, sir. Upgraded to indefinite closure pending completion of the investigation." He handed me another notice, this one more official-looking than the last. "This area is now under restricted access protocol." I read the document, my frustration mounting with each bureaucratic phrase. The notice cited 3 separate county ordinances and included language about permanent structures, commercial throughway regulations, and environmental impact assessment. None of it made sense for a simple gravel farm road. "Deputy," I said, keeping my voice measured, "I have a delivery scheduled in 30 minutes. $3,000 worth of fencing materials that I need for my livestock." He shifted uncomfortably. "I have been instructed not to allow any vehicles through, sir." "Can you at least call Sheriff Dawson? This is going beyond reasonable enforcement." "She is in meetings all morning." He hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Between you and me, I would reschedule your delivery again. This is not going to be resolved quickly." I thanked him for the advice, though it offered little comfort. When the delivery truck arrived 20 minutes later, the driver was understandably frustrated. Rerouting to the north field would add miles to his journey on unpaved terrain not suitable for his vehicle. "I cannot do it, man," he said, shaking his head. "Company policy. We deliver to proper access points only. Insurance will not cover off-road deliveries." I ended up paying a $750 restocking fee, plus losing the discount I had negotiated for the materials. The fencing company promised to try again in 2 weeks, but warned they would charge additional fees if access issues continued. Meanwhile, my cattle were contained only by temporary electric fencing that required constant maintenance and was vulnerable to failure. That afternoon, I drove to the county clerk's office and filed a formal complaint about the road closure. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Brenda, accepted my paperwork without comment. When I asked about the timeline for response, she simply said, "We will forward it to the appropriate department." "And who would that be?" I asked. "The sheriff's department handles all road access disputes in unincorporated areas," she replied without looking up. The circular logic was maddening. I was filing a complaint about Sheriff Dawson's actions, which would be reviewed by Sheriff Dawson's office. I left the clerk's office no closer to a solution than when I arrived. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation only worsened. The barricade became a fixture, staffed around the clock by deputies who seemed to have nothing better to do than guard an empty farm road. They sat in their vehicles for hours, occasionally walking the perimeter of my property line, but never actually conducting any visible investigation. I began keeping a log of their activities, or lack thereof. Deputy Johnson appeared most mornings, replaced in the afternoon by Deputy Collins, an older officer who spent most of his shift on his phone. They changed shifts at precisely 2:00 p.m., suggesting this was an official assignment rather than a temporary measure. Meanwhile, the costs mounted. I had to hire a neighbor's teenager to help move feed bags from where I now had to park, half a mile from my barn. I missed a veterinary appointment because the vet could not access my property to examine a sick calf. The animal recovered, but it was a close call that could have easily gone the other way. The most infuriating incident came when I arranged for a hay delivery. The driver called me, confused, saying a deputy had stopped him on the highway before he even reached my turnoff. He asked where I was headed, and when I said your name, he told me the delivery was canceled, the driver explained. Said you had called it off. I had done no such thing. They were now actively interfering with my business, spreading misinformation to my suppliers. That night, I drove past my own road entrance and saw Deputy Collins asleep in his cruiser, the engine running to keep the air conditioning on in the mild spring evening. My tax dollars at work, preventing me from accessing my own property. After 3 weeks of blockades, bureaucratic stonewalling, and mounting financial losses, I filed another complaint, this time directly to the county commissioner's office. I detailed the harassment, the unnecessary surveillance, and the complete lack of actual investigative work being done. The response came 2 days later, a form letter stating that road access disputes were under the jurisdiction of the sheriff's department, and my complaint had been forwarded accordingly. At the bottom, a handwritten note added, "Mr. McCormick, please contact Sheriff Dawson's office to resolve this matter." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by unanswered complaints, financial statements showing mounting losses, and the log of deputy activities I had been keeping. Through the window, I could see the distant flashing lights of the cruiser stationed at my road entrance, a constant reminder of my powerlessness. Something had to change. If Sheriff Sheila Dawson wanted to play games with my livelihood, then it was time I learned the rules. More importantly, it was time I gathered evidence of exactly what game she was playing. Hash. The solution came to me while watching a nature documentary. The show featured wildlife researchers using hidden cameras to document animal behavior without disturbing their subjects. If scientists could track elusive wolves and mountain lions, I could certainly monitor the activities of predictable deputies following a set routine. The next morning, I drove to Riverdale, the neighboring county's largest town, and visited their electronics store. I did not want to make my purchases locally, where word might get back to Sheriff Dawson. The salesman was helpful once I explained I needed cameras for wildlife monitoring on my farm. Technically true, though the wildlife I intended to observe wore badges. I purchased 4 motion-activated cameras with night vision capability. They were weatherproof, battery-operated, and could be strapped to trees inconspicuously. Most importantly, they had sufficient memory capacity to record several days of footage before needing to be checked. The entire setup cost nearly $2,000, money I could ill afford to spend after weeks of disrupted farm operations, but an investment that might finally give me leverage. Implementation required careful planning. The cameras needed to be positioned where they could capture the road blockade and the deputies' activities without being easily spotted. I studied maps of my property, identifying trees and fence posts with clear sightlines to the entrance road. Under cover of darkness, I hiked across my own fields, avoiding the main road where deputies were stationed. The first camera went on an old oak tree that stood just inside my property line, angled to capture the gate and anyone approaching it. The second I mounted on a fence post facing the area where deputies typically parked. The third covered the wider approach to the road from the highway, while the fourth gave me a view of the cattle trail I now used as my personal access path, in case they decided to block that too. I camouflaged each camera with branches and leaves, making them nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. After testing that each was functioning properly, I retreated to my house and waited. The first day's footage was enlightening. Deputy Johnson arrived precisely at 6:00 a.m., relieving the night deputy. After a brief conversation, the night deputy left, and Johnson settled in for his shift. For the next 8 hours, he did virtually nothing related to any investigation. He made phone calls, ate breakfast, napped for nearly an hour, and occasionally got out to stretch his legs. At no point did he take measurements, collect samples, or conduct any activity that could be construed as investigating road safety. Deputy Collins arrived at 2:00 p.m., bringing coffee for both of them. They chatted for 15 minutes before Johnson departed. Collins was even less active than his colleague, spending most of his shift on his phone or reading what appeared to be a paperback novel. The night deputy, whom I had not previously met, spent his entire shift in the vehicle except for 2 brief bathroom breaks behind a tree. Again, no investigative work whatsoever. I downloaded the footage to my laptop and began organizing it chronologically, adding notes about activities and timestamps. By the end of the first week, I had compiled over 100 hours of video showing a pattern of inactivity that contradicted any claim of an ongoing investigation. On the 8th day, I captured something far more valuable. At 7:30 p.m., just after sunset, an unmarked black SUV pulled up beside Deputy Collins' cruiser. Sheriff Sheila Dawson emerged, dressed in civilian clothes rather than her uniform. The camera's infrared function clearly showed her face as she spoke with Collins, who straightened up immediately in her presence. They talked for approximately 10 minutes, during which she gestured several times toward my property. Collins handed her a clipboard, which she reviewed before returning it with what appeared to be her signature. Before leaving, she walked to the gate, took several photographs with her phone, and made a slow survey of the visible portion of my property. The entire visit lasted less than 15 minutes, but it confirmed what I had suspected. This blockade had Sheriff Dawson's direct involvement and oversight. This was not some routine procedure delegated to subordinates. She was personally monitoring the situation. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued gathering footage, downloading it every 3 days under cover of darkness. I established a secure digital archive, backing everything up to external drives that I stored in different locations. If anything happened to my equipment, the evidence would survive. The cameras captured Deputy Johnson turning away 3 separate deliveries attempting to reach my farm, including feed supplies I had ordered. They documented Collins preventing a friend from visiting me by claiming the property was under quarantine, a blatant lie that was nowhere in the official notices. Most damning of all, they recorded Sheila herself making 2 more evening visits, each time taking photographs and reviewing paperwork with her deputies. During one visit, with no one else present, she walked the perimeter of my road entrance with a measuring wheel, the kind used to mark property boundaries. She took readings and made notes, paying particular attention to the corners of my property that adjoined the county highway. What interest could the sheriff possibly have in my property boundaries? The question lingered in my mind as I reviewed the footage. By the end of the 3rd week, I had compiled an extensive archive of video evidence showing a pattern of harassment and obstruction that went far beyond any legitimate law enforcement purpose. What I did not yet have was motive. Why was Sheriff Sheila Dawson so interested in my farm road? What did she hope to gain by cutting off my access? The answer would come from an unexpected direction, and it would reveal that my situation was not unique. Sheriff Dawson had been playing this game for years, and I was merely her latest target. Hash. Armed with 3 weeks of surveillance footage, I began searching for context. If Sheriff Dawson had targeted me, had she done the same to others? The local newspaper archives provided my first clues. Over the past 3 years, there had been numerous complaints about road closures, access restrictions, and permit denials in the rural parts of Hawkins County. Each incident, taken alone, seemed like routine bureaucratic friction. Together, they formed a pattern. I created a timeline on my dining room table, using string to connect newspaper clippings, my own footage dates, and notes from conversations with neighbors. The visual representation was striking. Sheriff Dawson's department had been involved in at least 17 land access disputes since she took office. Most ended with the landowner either selling property or agreeing to easements that had not previously existed. With this framework in place, I began reaching out to those affected. Many were reluctant to speak at first. Some refused outright, fear evident in their voices. But others, perhaps sensing a chance for accountability, agreed to meet discreetly. Walter Davidson, a retired schoolteacher who had planned to build a small cabin on his 5 acres, told me how his access road was suddenly deemed structurally unsound, despite having been used without incident for decades. After 3 months of fighting, I sold the parcel to Midwest Development Group, he explained as we sat in a diner 2 counties away. Got less than market value, but I just wanted out of the nightmare. 2 weeks after the sale, the road was magically reopened. Sarah Miller, a widow trying to maintain her late husband's horse farm, had a similar experience. The sheriff's department blocked my southern access road, claiming it was improperly graded. I could not get feed trucks in, could not move my horses. Eventually, I had to sell the back 40 acres to cover my losses. The buyer in her case, a hunting club whose membership included several county officials. The most revealing conversation came from an unexpected source. I was at the hardware store in Riverdale when I recognized an older man buying plumbing supplies. Robert Hendricks had been a deputy in Hawkins County for 30 years before retiring just as Sheila Dawson took office. We had never been close, but he had always been fair in his dealings with my father. I approached him cautiously, introduced myself, and asked if he had time for coffee. At a quiet table in the back of the store's small cafe, I shared what I had discovered. "I am not surprised," he said after I finished. "Sheila was always ambitious, even as a junior deputy. She understood that in rural counties, controlling access means controlling land, and controlling land means power. But blocking roads seems so petty," I replied. Robert shook his head. "It is strategic. You cannot sell what you cannot reach. You cannot farm what you cannot access. Create enough problems for a landowner, and eventually they will look for the easiest way out. Usually, that means selling to whoever Sheila suggests." "How is this legal?" I asked. "It is legal because she uses legitimate regulations selectively. Traffic safety, environmental concerns, permit requirements, all real regulations that she applies only against people who stand in her way." He leaned forward. "What you have done with these cameras, that is the first real evidence I have seen of the pattern." Before leaving, Robert suggested I contact Martin Weber, an attorney in the state capitol who specialized in rural land disputes. "Tell him I sent you," he added, "and be careful. Sheila does not lose gracefully." That evening, I consolidated everything I had gathered, my footage, newspaper articles, and accounts from other victims. The pattern was undeniable. Sheriff Dawson used road closures as the first move in a longer strategy to force compliance or property sales. The question was, what did she want from me? The answer came from Sarah Miller, who called me the following day. "I remembered something," she said. "Before all my troubles started, I was approached about selling that back 40 acres. I refused. 2 weeks later, my road problems began." "Who approached you?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "Midwest Development Group, same company that bought Walter's land. They said they were assembling parcels for a special project. When I looked them up later, guess who owns 40% of the company?" "Sheriff Dawson," I guessed. "No, her brother-in-law Thomas Grayson, but she is connected to it, I am certain." I thanked her and immediately pulled up a county map. My property bordered the highway at its southeastern corner, prime real estate if someone wanted to develop commercial property with highway frontage. To the east was the old Miller Farm, now partly owned by the hunting club. To the west was Walter Davidson's former land, now owned by Midwest Development. The puzzle pieces aligned with chilling clarity. My farm was the missing link in what appeared to be a larger land acquisition strategy. Block my road, disrupt my business, and wait for financial pressure to force me to sell, just as it had worked with the others. That night, I compiled everything into a secure online folder and made copies on 3 separate drives. I placed one in my home safe, gave another to a trusted friend in Riverdale, and kept the third with me at all times. Then I contacted Martin Weber and scheduled a consultation. The time for merely documenting had passed. If Sheriff Sheila Dawson wanted to play power games with people's livelihoods, then it was time to change the rules. I was no longer just protecting my farm road. I was fighting for everyone she had ever pushed around. The morning after I compiled my evidence archive, a white county truck with code enforcement emblazoned on its doors pulled into my yard. 2 men in khaki uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand. I recognized neither of them, which was unusual in our small community where most officials were familiar faces. "Mr. McCormick," the taller one approached, his expression professionally blank. "I am Inspector Wilson from County Code Enforcement. We have received a complaint about possible violations on your property." I wiped my hands on a rag, having been in the middle of fixing a tractor hydraulic line. "Complaint? From whom?" Wilson consulted his clipboard. "The report was filed by the Sheriff's Department during routine patrol. We are required to investigate." Of course, Sheriff Dawson was changing tactics. I gestured toward the barn. "What exactly are you looking for?" "Agricultural equipment storage, fuel containment systems, fence line compliance, and noise ordinance verification." He recited the list as if reading a grocery receipt. Standard procedure. There was nothing standard about it. In 20 years of farming, neither my father nor I had ever received a code enforcement visit. I accompanied the inspectors as they methodically examined every corner of my property, taking photographs and making notes. They measured the height of my storage shed, inspected my diesel tank, and walked my entire fence line with a measuring wheel. The next morning, the first citation arrived by certified mail. My fence was allegedly 4 inches higher than allowed by county agricultural code, a regulation I had never heard of in my life. The citation included a $250 fine and a demand for immediate remediation. 2 days later, a second citation arrived. My fuel storage tank, which had been inspected and approved when installed 5 years earlier, now supposedly violated a new containment requirement. Another $500 fine, plus the cost of installing a new concrete containment pad estimated at several $1,000s. The third citation was the most absurd. A noise complaint about my tractor operating during restricted hours. The citation listed specific dates and times when I had supposedly violated noise ordinances, dates when my tractor had been in the repair shop 30 miles away. I contacted Martin Weber, the attorney Robert Hendricks had recommended. After reviewing the citations and my evidence, he was blunt. "This is textbook harassment," he said. "They are throwing everything at you, hoping something sticks, or more likely hoping you will give up." "What should I do?" I asked. "Appeal each citation formally, document everything, and keep those cameras running." I followed his advice, filing appeals against all 3 citations. The process was frustratingly complex, requiring separate forms for each violation, notarized statements, and a $75 filing fee per appeal, money I could ill afford after weeks of disrupted operations. The harassment intensified. One morning I received a text from Jim at the feed store. "Sheriff Deputy just questioned me about feed delivery to your place. Wanted to know what you were ordering, how much. Seemed off. Watch yourself." That same afternoon, my regular fuel supplier called to cancel a scheduled delivery. "Sorry, but I got pulled over twice last time I came out your way. Cannot risk the hassle for one customer." The most brazen incident came 3 days later. I was repairing fencing on the far side of my property when my phone buzzed with an alert from one of my hidden cameras. 2 sheriff's deputies, neither Johnson nor Collins, but men I had never seen before, were walking around my equipment shed, peering through windows and trying the door. They were not on the road or at the blockade. They were deep on my property with no warning or warrant. I immediately called Martin Weber. "They are trespassing," I told him, watching the live feed as the deputies continued their unauthorized inspection. "Do not confront them," he warned. "That is exactly what they want, a reason to escalate. Let your cameras do the work." I watched, my anger building, as they circled my shed, took photographs, and eventually departed. When I checked the footage later, I heard one deputy clearly say to the other, "Dawson wants dirt on this guy. Anything we can use." That evening I received a call from Sarah Miller, the widow who had been forced to sell part of her farm. "They are at it again," she said, her voice trembling. "A deputy came by today asking questions about you. Wanted to know if I had ever seen you angry or violent, if you had ever threatened anyone." "What did you tell them?" I asked. "That they should be ashamed doing Sheila's dirty work." Her voice grew stronger. "I am tired of being afraid of her. We all are." That night I reviewed all my footage, organized my documentation, and made a decision. The next morning I called Martin Weber. "I want to go public," I told him. "All of it. The roadblock, the surveillance, the harassment, everything." There was a long pause before he responded. "You understand what that means. Sheila Dawson will come at you with everything she has. It will get worse before it gets better. She is already coming at me with everything, and she is doing the same to my neighbors, to people who cannot fight back." I thought of Sarah Miller, of Walter Davidson, of all the others who had been pushed around. It is time to stop playing defense. "Then let us do it right," Martin said. "I will help you prepare a presentation for the county council, something they cannot ignore." I hung up the phone and walked to my barn, where I kept a framed photograph of my father standing proudly on this land. He had taught me that a farmer needs to know when to plant, when to harvest, and when to stand his ground. This was not just about my road anymore. It was about justice for an entire community that had lived too long under Sheila Dawson's corrupt rule. The quiet farmer was about to get very, very loud. Martin Weber knew how to craft a narrative. For 3 days, we worked together to compile a presentation that would be undeniable. We avoided emotional appeals or personal attacks. Instead, we presented a chronological documentation of Sheriff Dawson's actions, supported by video evidence, witness statements, and official documents. Facts speak louder than accusations, Martin advised as we edited the final video compilation. Let people see the pattern themselves. The final product was a 15-minute video that began with my road blockade and expanded to show similar tactics used against other property owners. We included time-stamped footage of deputies doing nothing during their supposed investigation, Sheila's after-hours visits, and the unauthorized trespass on my property. Interspersed were statements from other victims, their faces visible and names disclosed, people who had finally found the courage to speak out. We ended with documentation of the business connections between Sheriff Dawson's brother-in-law, Thomas Grayson, and the properties that had been acquired after similar harassment campaigns. The pattern was clear even to an impartial observer. At precisely 7:00 a.m. on a Monday morning, we released the video simultaneously to 3 platforms: the County Community Facebook group, a regional news outlet's tip line, and a newly created website called Hawkins County Accountability Project. Martin also submitted formal copies to every county council member and the state attorney general's office. I expected a slow build of attention. What happened instead was an explosion. By noon, the video had been viewed over 10,000 times, remarkable for a county with only 30,000 residents. The comment sections flooded with similar stories, people coming forward to share their own experiences with Sheriff Dawson's department. Some were minor incidents, others were major land disputes, but the pattern was unmistakable. Local radio stations picked up the story by mid-afternoon. By evening, 2 regional television news teams had contacted me for interviews. Martin handled the media inquiries, insisting that I remain focused on the evidence rather than personal grievances. "This is not about you versus Sheila," he reminded me. "It is about the system she created." The community response was overwhelming. Farmers I had known my entire life called to express support. Business owners in town shared stories of permit delays and inspections that disappeared after the right palms were greased. Even teenage students from the local high school created a TikTok challenge called Sheriff Sheila Shutdown that went viral in our region. By the second day, the county council announced an emergency session to address the allegations. The chairman, a typically cautious politician named Harris, made a brief statement. "These are serious claims that deserve serious investigation. The council will review all evidence and take appropriate action." Sheriff Dawson's response came late that afternoon, a press release that read like it had been written by a committee of lawyers. It mentioned unfounded allegations, proper procedural enforcement, and politically motivated attacks. She claimed my road had been closed due to structural concerns discovered during routine patrol, but offered no documentation to support this claim. The most telling line came at the end. "The sheriff's department has always acted to protect rural standards and community safety, even when such actions prove temporarily inconvenient to individual landowners." That night, I received calls from 2 deputies who wished to remain anonymous. Both expressed discomfort with what had been happening in the department. One mentioned a weekly target list that Sheila distributed, focusing enforcement efforts on specific properties. The other confirmed that the trespass on my property had been directly ordered by Dawson herself, outside of normal procedure. Martin recorded these conversations with their permission. "More pieces for the puzzle," he said. By the 3rd day, state officials had taken notice. The Attorney General's office requested copies of all evidence for review. A state police captain contacted Martin to discuss potential jurisdiction issues, especially regarding the connection between enforcement actions and property acquisitions. The most powerful moment came unexpectedly. Sarah Miller, the widow who had lost part of her farm, organized an impromptu gathering of Dawson's victims at the courthouse steps. 17 people stood together, holding signs with simple messages: "My land, my rights, and end the corruption." Local news captured the moment, and by evening their faces were on screens across the state. I watched it all unfold with a mixture of validation and anxiety. The truth was spreading like wildfire, unstoppable and cleansing. But I knew Sheriff Dawson well enough by now to understand she would not go down without a fight. That night, as I checked my cameras before bed, I saw headlights approach my blockaded road. A cruiser stopped briefly, then continued on. Message received. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since those orange cones appeared, I felt the momentum shifting. The quiet had been broken. The truth was marching forward like an army that could not be turned back. Hash. The County Council emergency session was scheduled for Thursday evening, just 4 days after our video went public. The meeting had been moved from the regular council chambers to the high school gymnasium to accommodate the expected crowd. By 6 o'clock, an hour before the scheduled start, the parking lot was full, and people were being directed to overflow areas. Martin and I arrived early, equipped with multiple copies of our evidence and a detailed presentation prepared for the council. We had been allocated 15 minutes to present our case, a time limit that seemed inadequate given the scope of the issues, but Martin assured me it would be sufficient. "Most county council meetings are lucky to get 10 attendees," he observed as we walked through the packed gymnasium. "This is something else entirely." Nearly 800 people filled the bleachers and folding chairs. Farmers in work clothes sat alongside business owners in ties. Young families with children mingled with elderly residents who had lived in Hawkins County their entire lives. News crews from 3 television stations had set up cameras along the back wall. Sheriff Dawson arrived 15 minutes before the meeting, flanked by 2 deputies and what appeared to be her legal counsel. She wore her full uniform, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her expression was composed, but I noticed the tightness around her mouth, the way her eyes darted around the room assessing the crowd. For perhaps the first time in her career, she was not in control of the narrative. Council Chairman Harris called the meeting to order precisely at 7. After brief preliminaries, he announced that the council had engaged an independent auditor from the state capitol to review all evidence and testimony. This auditor, a former judge named Eleanor Blackwell, would have full authority to access county records and interview personnel. "Until this review is complete," Harris continued, "the council has voted to place certain restrictions on departmental operations. Effective immediately, all road access enforcement actions are suspended pending review. Any active blockades or access restrictions must be removed by noon tomorrow, unless documented safety concerns can be independently verified by county engineers." A murmur ran through the crowd. Sheriff Dawson leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently. Harris continued, "Additionally, Sheriff Dawson will recuse herself from any land use enforcement or property access decisions until the review is complete. These functions will temporarily fall under the direct oversight of Chief Deputy Marshal." Chief Deputy Marshal, a career law enforcement officer close to retirement, had been conspicuously absent from all the footage we had gathered. According to my sources, he had maintained professional distance from Dawson's more questionable activities. When my time came to present, I focused on the facts rather than emotions, exactly as Martin had coached me. I showed the time-stamped footage, presented the timeline of events, and demonstrated the pattern of enforcement actions followed by property acquisitions. I ended by handing the council a folder containing statements from 17 county residents who had experienced similar treatment. This is not about a single road or a single farm, I concluded. This is about a systematic abuse of power that has affected dozens of families and businesses across Hawkins County. Sheriff Dawson's response was measured but defensive. She presented the blockade of my road as part of a broader traffic safety initiative, though she provided no documentation of actual safety concerns. She denied any connection to property acquisitions through her brother-in-law, calling such allegations baseless conspiracy theories. Throughout her presentation, scattered murmurs and even occasional derisive laughter came from the audience. The most dramatic moment of the evening came from an unexpected source. Deputy Johnson, the same officer who had first blocked my road, approached the microphone during the public comment period. His hands trembled slightly as he identified himself. "I have been with the department for 8 years," he began. "During that time, I have followed orders as any deputy would, but I can no longer remain silent about what I have witnessed." The gymnasium fell completely silent as Johnson described a department culture of selective enforcement, where properties were targeted based on factors unrelated to public safety. He confirmed the existence of a priority enforcement list that came directly from Sheriff Dawson's office. Most damning of all, he produced a department memo entitled Access Control Strategies that explicitly described using road closures as leverage in property negotiations. "I took an oath to uphold the law equally for all citizens," Johnson concluded. "That oath has been compromised, and I cannot stand by any longer." As he returned to his seat, avoiding Sheriff Dawson's glare, another deputy stood up, then another. By the end of the evening, 5 members of the sheriff's department had come forward with their own accounts of questionable directives and practices. The council meeting concluded with Chairman Harris announcing 3 immediate actions. First, all road blockades would be removed pending independent safety verification. Second, an oversight committee would review all enforcement actions taken by the sheriff's department over the past 3 years. Third, Deputy Johnson's memo and other evidence would be forwarded to the state attorney general for potential criminal investigation. As the crowd dispersed, I noticed Sheriff Dawson in an intense conversation with her attorney. Her face was flushed, her gestures animated. For the first time since I had known her, Sheriff Sheila Dawson looked genuinely afraid. My road barricade was removed by county workers at 9:00 a.m. the following morning. The deputies who had maintained the blockade for weeks were nowhere to be seen. As I drove down my own gravel road for the first time in over a month, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. But I knew this was just the beginning of a longer process of accountability. The storm had finally reached Sheriff Dawson's doorstep, and the winds of justice were only growing stronger. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the county council meeting. During that time, Alina Blackwell, the independent auditor, had conducted a thorough investigation of the sheriff's department. Her team had interviewed deputies, reviewed department records, and examined the evidence we had provided. They had also discovered records we had not had access to, internal emails, budget allocations, and personnel files that painted an even more disturbing picture of corruption. The hearing would take place in the county courthouse, in the same room where criminal trials were held. It seemed fitting. This was, in many ways, a trial of Hawkins County's justice system itself. Martin and I arrived an hour early, along with Sarah Miller, Walter Davidson, and several others who had been victimized by Sheriff Dawson's tactics. We sat together in the gallery, drawing strength from each other's presence. The courtroom filled quickly with residents, reporters, and county officials. By the time the proceedings began, people were standing along the back wall. Sheriff Dawson entered flanked by two attorneys. She wore her uniform, though Chairman Harris had specifically stated that this was an administrative hearing, not a law enforcement function. It seemed like a deliberate attempt to remind everyone of her authority that was now in serious jeopardy. The hearing began with Alina Blackwell presenting her findings. Her voice was calm and methodical as she detailed what her investigation had uncovered. She presented evidence of selective enforcement patterns, unauthorized surveillance, and documented cases where road closures had been followed by property acquisitions by companies connected to Dawson's family members. "The pattern is not merely suspicious," Blackwell stated. "It is systematic. My team has identified 27 instances over the past 3 years where enforcement actions directly preceded property transfers to a small network of connected entities." She presented internal department emails in which Sheriff Dawson had specifically identified properties as acquisition targets and directed deputies to find regulatory violations that could be leveraged against the owners. She showed budget reports where deputies had been paid overtime for surveillance activities listed as special enforcement projects, without proper documentation. Most damning was the discovery of a meeting calendar showing regular gatherings between Sheriff Dawson, her brother-in-law Thomas Grayson, and developers from Midwest Development Group. These meetings were scheduled shortly before enforcement actions began against specific properties. As the evidence mounted, I watched Sheriff Dawson's composure gradually crumble. The confident smirk gave way to a tight-lipped grimace. She whispered urgently to her attorneys, who looked increasingly concerned as the presentation continued. After Blackwell completed her findings, witnesses were called to testify. Sarah Miller described how her road had been blocked immediately after she refused an offer from Midwest Development Group. Walter Davidson explained how permit delays and access restrictions had made it impossible to build on his land until he finally sold it at a loss. Each testimony added another piece to the puzzle of corruption. When my turn came, I presented my evidence calmly and clearly, just as Martin had coached me. I explained how my cameras had documented not only the lack of any actual road investigation, but also Sheila's after-hours visits and her deputy's unauthorized trespass onto my property. This was never about road safety, I concluded. It was about pressure. It was about power. It was about forcing people to give up their property when they did not want to sell. Sheriff Dawson's defense strategy quickly became apparent: blame subordinates, claim ignorance of details, and insist that any connection to property acquisitions was coincidental. Her primary attorney attempted to paint her as a dedicated public servant whose deputies had misinterpreted her directives or acted without proper authorization. "Sheriff Dawson has served this county with distinction," he argued. "She cannot be held responsible for the unauthorized actions of every deputy under her command." The strategy collapsed when Deputy Johnson took the stand. He brought with him the original access control strategies memo, not a copy, but the actual document with Sheriff Dawson's handwritten notes in the margins. On one page, she had explicitly written beside a property address, "Priority target. Thompson wants this by August. Close access points and escalate until owner contacts realtor." Sheriff Dawson did not just know about these tactics. Johnson testified. She created them, she directed them, and she rewarded deputies who successfully pressured landowners into selling. When Sheriff Dawson finally took the stand, her testimony was a study in contradictions. She denied direct involvement while simultaneously defending the practices as legitimate enforcement. She claimed ignorance of her brother-in-law's business dealings while being unable to explain why she had met with him and developers immediately before enforcement actions. Her voice grew increasingly defensive, her answers more convoluted as the questioning continued. The defining moment came when Alina Blackwell presented a series of text messages recovered from a department phone. In them, Sheriff Dawson had explicitly instructed deputies to find violations on the McCormick property and make his life difficult until he sees reason. "Would you care to explain these messages, Sheriff Dawson?" Blackwell asked. Sheila's response was telling. Instead of another denial, she attacked. "You people do not understand what it takes to bring progress to a backward county like this. These old farms, these obsolete properties, they are holding back development, holding back tax revenue, holding back the future. Sometimes people need to be pushed toward progress." The admission hung in the air, stunning in its arrogance. Even her attorneys seemed taken aback by the outburst. Chairman Harris called for a brief recess, during which Sheriff Dawson could be seen in heated discussion with her legal team. When the hearing reconvened, the disciplinary board took less than 30 minutes to reach their decision. Sheriff Sheila Dawson was immediately relieved of all duties pending criminal investigation. Her department would be placed under state supervision until reforms could be implemented. The board voted unanimously to refer the case to the state attorney general for prosecution on charges of official misconduct, abuse of power, conspiracy, and possible racketeering. As the gavel fell on the decision, I looked at Sheriff Dawson. For the first time, I saw the truth behind her badge. Not a law enforcement officer, but a bully who had finally been stood up to. She avoided my gaze as she was escorted from the courtroom, no longer in control, no longer above accountability. Justice, like a long-delayed harvest, had finally arrived in Hawkins County. The metal gate that had blocked my farm road for so long came down on a clear Thursday morning in June. County workers removed it with little ceremony. The screech of metal and clang of chain linked the only soundtrack to the moment. I watched from my truck, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and lingering anger. One of the workers, a man I recognized from town, gave me a respectful nod as they loaded the last pieces into their truck. "Should never have been here in the first place," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Sorry about all this, Mr. McCormick." His simple apology mattered more than he could know. It represented the first acknowledgement from the county that a wrong had been done, not just to me, but to everyone who had suffered under Sheila Dawson's corrupt regime. Later that day, a more official apology arrived, a formal letter from the county council expressing regret for the unwarranted restrictions placed on my property and assuring me that reforms were being implemented to prevent similar abuses in the future. Sheriff Dawson's resignation came 3 days after the disciplinary hearing. She submitted it through her attorney, avoiding any public statement or appearance. The local newspaper printed it alongside a timeline of the investigation and hearings, a visual representation of how quickly power can crumble when truth finally emerges. The criminal investigation continued. State prosecutors had begun interviewing witnesses, collecting documentation, and building their case. Martin warned me that legal proceedings could take months or even years to complete, but I found I was no longer fixated on Sheila Dawson's fate. My focus had shifted to something more constructive, ensuring that what happened to me, to Sarah, to Walter, and to countless others would never happen again in Hawkins County. 2 weeks after the gate came down, I hosted a gathering at my farm. More than 50 people attended, farmers, business owners, retirees, all of whom had experienced or witnessed Dawson's abuse of power. We met in my barn, sitting on hay bales and folding chairs, sharing stories and perspectives. What began as a cathartic venting session evolved into something more purposeful. By evening's end, we had formed the Hawkins County Rural Rights Coalition. Our mission was simple: promote transparency in local government, educate citizens about their property rights, and serve as watchdogs against abuse of power. Sarah Miller was elected chairperson, her quiet determination making her the perfect leader for our fledgling organization. "This is not about revenge," she told the group. "It is about building something better from what we have learned." Deputy Johnson, who had risked his career to come forward, was hired by the interim sheriff as a community liaison officer, tasked with rebuilding trust between the department and rural residents. He stopped by my farm occasionally, not as a law enforcement officer, but as a neighbor making amends. The investigation into Midwest Development Group revealed connections to several county officials beyond Sheriff Dawson. 2 commissioners resigned rather than face ethics investigations. Thomas Grayson, Sheila's brother-in-law, sold his interest in the company and left the state ahead of potential indictments. The development projects that had motivated so much of the corruption were placed on indefinite hold. Gradually, life on my farm returned to its natural rhythm. I repaired the fencing that had been delayed for so long. I scheduled deliveries without fear of interference. I worked my fields from dawn until dusk, finding healing in the simple, honest labor that had sustained my family for generations. One evening, nearly 6 months after the road blockade had first appeared, I walked the gravel path from the highway to my barn just as the sun was setting. The air was cool, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. Crickets chirped in the tall grass along the fence line. It was a moment of profound peace, the kind that comes not from the absence of conflict, but from having faced it and emerged stronger. Near the old oak tree where I had mounted my first camera, I paused. The camera was still there, its lens catching the last light of day. I had kept it, along with the others, long after the need for surveillance had passed. Not out of fear or paranoia, but as a reminder of resilience, of community, of the power of truth in the face of corruption. I reached up and adjusted the camera slightly, ensuring it had a clear view of the road. Not because I expected trouble to return, not because I needed evidence anymore, but because in Hawkins County things had changed. The watchful eyes were no longer just those of a corrupt sheriff monitoring her targets. Now, citizens were awake and vigilant, determined that power would never again go unchecked. As I walked back to my house in the gathering dusk, boots kicking up small clouds of gravel dust, I felt a deep contentment. My road was open, my farm was thriving, and in our small corner of rural America, justice had taken root like a sturdy crop, promising a harvest for years to come. Some nights I still watch the footage from those cameras, not the confrontations or the evidence, but the simple scenes of my road now free from barricades, of neighbors driving by with a wave, of life continuing as it should. It reminds me that some battles are worth fighting, not just for yourself, but for something larger, for community, for principle, for the quiet dignity of being left in peace on your own land. And somewhere in Hawkins County, I like to think Sheriff Sheila Dawson sometimes drives past a farm road she can no longer block, past land she can no longer control, and remembers the farmer who planted cameras instead of fear.